And he was explaining that she was injured. When in fact the private secretary, Michael, was telling the six of us in the office that sadly she'd died.
There are moments in history that divide time itself, a before and an after moment so shattering that they leave permanent marks not just on nations, but on individual human souls who happen to be standing nearby when everything fell apart. August 31st, 1997, was one of those moments. The world woke up to news that Princess Diana, the most photographed woman on the planet, the people's princess, the mother of the future king, was gone. And for 27 years, the people who were closest to that tragedy, the ones who lived it from the inside, largely kept their silence. But silence, no matter how long it holds, eventually breaks. Colin Tebbit served as Princess Diana's personal driver for years. He was not a stranger to her. He was not a distant figure who occasionally glimpsed her through a rear-view mirror. He was someone she trusted, someone whose presence was woven into the fabric of her daily life. He knew her routines, her moods, her humor. He was part of the quiet machinery that kept her world moving, and on the night that world stopped, he was pulled into a story that he has carried privately for decades. Now, for the first time, Colin is speaking, and what he has to say does not simply add footnotes to a story we thought we already knew. It reframes the entire experience, pulling back the curtain on the deeply human drama that unfolded behind the screaming headlines, the conspiracy theories, the royal statements, and the sea of flowers left outside Kensington Palace. His words take us somewhere the cameras never reached. This is that story. To understand why Colin Tebbit's silence mattered, and why his breaking of it matters even more, you first have to understand who he was to Princess Diana and what his role truly meant. Being a personal driver for a member of the royal family is not simply a job of transportation. It is a position of extraordinary trust. You are present during the in-between moments of a person's life. The quiet rides after public engagements, the early morning departures, the late-night returns. You see a person when the performance is over and the mask, however briefly, comes off. You hear fragments of phone calls. You sense moods. You become a reliable, discreet, trusted constant in a life that is otherwise surrounded by chaos, scrutiny, and protocol. Colin was exactly that for Diana. Over the years he served her, he accumulated not just professional experience, but genuine human connection. Those who knew the princess described her as someone who never treated the people who worked for her as invisible. She remembered names, asked about families, cracked jokes, showed genuine curiosity about the lives of the people around her. For someone in her position, hemmed in on all sides by formality and expectation, those moments of human connection were not small things. They were how she stayed herself. Colin experienced that version of Diana, the real one, the one that existed in the car between destinations, away from cameras. And that intimate knowledge is precisely what makes his silence over these decades so understandable, and his decision to finally speak so significant. He was not protecting a myth. He was protecting a memory that he personally held, and that he considered sacred. When you carry something like that, the last vivid memories of someone who was taken suddenly and violently from the world, the weight of those memories does not diminish with time. If anything, it grows heavier, because the world keeps talking, keeps speculating, keeps reshaping the narrative, and all the while you are sitting with something the public version of events never quite captures the truth of who she was as a human being. That is what Colin brings to this conversation. Not sensationalism, not score settling, but truth, offered with a kind of careful, grieving reverence that only comes from someone who genuinely loved and respected the person they lost. The evening of August 30th, 1997, passed without any particular foreboding. Diana was in Paris with Dodi Fayed, and the world that watched her every move was largely focused on speculation about their relationship rather than any sense of imminent danger. Paris in late summer has a particular quality: warm evenings, golden light, the city in that languid, unhurried mood that August brings. For the people who would later become part of this story, it was just another night. Colin was at home in England, That detail matters, and he has spoken about it with a mixture of relief and tortured regret that is difficult to fully articulate. He was not in Paris. He was not behind the wheel. And that simple fact, the randomness of his absence from that specific night, has haunted him in ways that are deeply irrational but completely human. The what-if question is one that grief plants in fertile soil, and it grows regardless of logic. What if he had been driving? What if different choices had been made? What if the sequence of events had been even slightly different? These are questions without answers, which is precisely what makes them so persistent. Colin has described the hours before he received the news as achingly ordinary. That contrast, the mundane domesticity of an evening at home, set against the catastrophic events unfolding simultaneously in a Paris tunnel, is something he has never been able to fully reconcile. Tragedy does not announce itself. It does not give you time to prepare or brace yourself. It arrives in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday night, or in this case, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, without ceremony or warning. The call came late. His wife answered first, a detail that Colin has mentioned as somehow adding to the surreal quality of the moment. A colleague calling from Balmoral. The initial tone of the conversation was ordinary, the kind of exchange that happens between people who know each other professionally, but something shifted. His wife's expression changed. She handed him the phone with a warning that he needed to be sitting down for what he was about to hear. Princess Diana had been involved in a serious crash in Paris. In those first seconds, the human mind does something strange with catastrophic news. It resists. It looks for alternative interpretations, softer readings of the same words. Colin has described a brief moment of desperate hope. Perhaps it was not as serious as it sounded. Perhaps she was injured but stable. Perhaps the reporter's characteristic tendency toward drama was inflating a manageable situation. But even as those thoughts formed, the television was already showing images that made hope difficult to sustain. The crash had happened in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The car was destroyed. The scene looked like something from a different, more violent world than the one Colin occupied, and he knew, with a particular certainty that comes not from information but from instinct, that this was not going to be all right. What happened next for Colin Tebbit was a transformation not just of circumstances, but of role and identity. He was no longer simply a driver waiting for his next assignment. He became something else entirely, a guardian of dignity, dispatched on a mission that no amount of professional training could have truly prepared anyone to undertake. The decision to send Colin to Paris to accompany Princess Diana's body home was not made carelessly. He was trusted. He knew her. He understood the weight of what the task required, even if the full emotional reality of it could not be anticipated until he was standing in it. The journey to Paris, first to Kensington Palace to receive his instructions, then to the airport, then across the Channel into a city that was already submerged in grief and chaos, was a journey that Colin has described as feeling simultaneously urgent and impossibly heavy. Kensington Palace in those early morning hours was a place caught between two realities. Officially, it was still processing what had happened. The formal mechanisms of royal protocol were beginning to engage, the necessary communications being made, the institutional response slowly assembling itself around the personal devastation. But beneath all of that, there were simply human beings in profound shock. Staff who had known Diana personally, people who had built their professional lives around serving her, and now they were being asked to continue serving, to continue functioning in the immediate aftermath of the worst possible news. Colin moved through that environment with a particular discipline that grief sometimes produces in people who have strong professional identities. There was work to be done. He focused on the work. The alternative, allowing the full emotional weight of what had happened to land fully in that moment, was not possible if he was going to do what needed to be done. The flight to Paris was quiet. Colin has spoken about the strangeness of that journey, the mechanical normalcy of air travel, the routine of it, set against the completely extraordinary nature of what he was flying toward. Outside the windows of the aircraft, The world looked the same as it always had. Below, life was continuing, and yet everything had changed. The disconnect between the world's indifferent continuation and the enormity of the personal loss he was carrying was disorienting in a way that is hard to communicate. Paris received him with chaos. The city was already swarming with media from every corner of the globe. Photographers, reporters, television crews, all of them drawn by the gravitational pull of the story, all of them pressing toward any detail, any image, any fragment of information they could transmit back to audiences who were consuming the news with an insatiable hunger. Colin arrived into this storm and had to find a way to move through it with purpose and discretion, which required a kind of emotional compartmentalization that he has described as one of the hardest things he has ever had to do. There were practical challenges layered on top of the emotional ones. Paris was foreign territory. The language barrier created additional complications that had to be navigated in real time, without preparation, in circumstances that allowed no margin for error. Colin has spoken about how grateful he was for the support of his wife, whose French language skills became unexpectedly essential in those difficult hours. It is one of those small human details that rarely makes it into the formal historical record, but that speaks volumes about the reality of operating in crisis. You are never as prepared as you need to be, and you make it work with whatever you have. Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital, one of Paris's oldest and most prestigious medical institutions, was the location where history's most watched medical emergency played out in those early morning hours of August 31st. By the time Colin arrived, the hospital had become something more than a medical facility. It had become the center of the world's grief. The atmosphere inside was unlike anything Colin had encountered before and has not encountered since. It was the particular atmosphere of a place where extraordinary effort is being expended, where skilled people are working at the very edge of their capabilities, and where the outcome remains uncertain, but where everyone present somehow already senses, on some level, what that outcome is going to be. There is a particular quality to desperate hope in a hospital. It is different from ordinary hope. It is louder and simultaneously much more fragile. Diana had arrived at the hospital with injuries of devastating severity. The crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel had subjected her body to FORCs that left her with extensive internal injuries, the most critical of which involved internal bleeding from a torn pulmonary vein near her heart. The trauma team that received her was experienced and skilled. These were not ordinary emergency physicians, but specialists at one of France's premier medical centers. They understood exactly what they were dealing with, and they worked with everything they had to change the outcome. The details of Diana's medical treatment in those final hours have been a subject of considerable public discussion and some controversy over the years. Colin's account does not dwell on clinical specifics with the detachment of a medical review. Instead, he conveys what it felt like to be present in that environment, the urgency, the professionalism, the increasingly grim reality that was settling over the hospital, even as the medical team refused to stop fighting. One of the procedures performed was emergency cardiac surgery, with Professor Alain Pavy, a distinguished cardiac surgeon, brought in specifically to address the damage to Diana's heart. The surgery was meticulous, thorough, and executed under enormous pressure by a team that understood the significance of what they were doing. They repaired what could be repaired. They tried what could be tried. And for a period that Colin has described as feeling both very long and impossibly short, the outcome remained technically open. But the damage was too extensive. The bleeding had compromised Diana's heart function to a degree that could not be reversed. Multiple attempts to restore her cardiac rhythm through electrical stimulation failed. The team continued their efforts for over an hour after the situation had become, in any objective medical assessment, hopeless. That detail matters enormously. They did not give up. They continued because the person on that table was Diana, and because the human instinct to fight against loss does not easily yield to clinical reality. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning, Paris time, the decision was made to cease resuscitation efforts. Princess Diana was pronounced dead. Colin has spoken about the moment he received confirmation of her death with a restraint that is more eloquent than any dramatic account could be. There are no words adequate to that moment. There is only the reality of it. The sudden, complete, irrevocable absence where presence used to be. The knowledge that someone you cared for and respected and served is gone, not temporarily, not conditionally, but permanently, and without any possibility of reversal. In the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, Colin Tebbit faced a responsibility that was simultaneously practical and profoundly emotional. Someone had to remain present. Someone had to ensure that even in death, even in a foreign hospital room, even surrounded by the noise and chaos and hunger of the world's media, pressing against every available boundary, Princess Diana was treated with the dignity she deserved. Colin took that responsibility upon himself. The room where Diana's body lay was not, in those initial hours, the environment one would have wished for someone of her significance to rest in. It was clinical, exposed, inadequately private given the circumstances. Windows were uncovered. The heat was considerable. The practical conditions were not what they should have been. And Colin, with a combination of improvisation and determination, set about changing that. He has described covering windows with blankets to shield her from the prying eyes of the world outside, arranging what limited resources were available to create some approximation of the privacy and quiet she deserved. These actions were not grand gestures. They were small, practical, human acts of care performed by someone who understood that dignity is not only a matter of ceremony and protocol, it is also a matter of someone noticing what needs to be done and doing it. There is a moment from this period that Colin has shared with particular emotional difficulty. The fans that had been arranged in the room to manage the heat created a slight movement of air, and at one point, that gentle breeze caused Diana's eyelashes to flutter. The movement was involuntary, a physical artifact with no conscious meaning. But for Colin, standing in that room already stretched to the emotional limit, it was almost unbearable. For just a fraction of a second, in the movement of her lashes, she seemed present again, and then she was not. He needed to step away for a few minutes. He has not described this as weakness, and it was not weakness. It was the honest human response of a person who cared deeply, being confronted with an unbearable reality in a particularly intimate way. He collected himself, as he always did, and returned to the work. But that moment has stayed with him. He carries it still. Throughout those hours in Paris, Colin maintained the composure required of his role, even as the emotional toll accumulated in ways that could not be expressed or processed in the moment. The media presence outside was relentless. The world wanted everything, every image, every detail, every fragment of information. And inside, one man was quietly doing the work of ensuring that the person at the center of all that hunger was treated not as a spectacle, but as a human being who deserved respect and privacy even now. Guilt is one of the most complicated and least rational of human emotions. It does not require culpability. It does not need a reasonable basis. It attaches itself to people not because they have done something wrong, but because they were connected to something terrible, and the human mind, searching for a framework that makes tragedy feel less random and therefore less terrifying, reaches for causation where none meaningfully exists. Colin Tebbit was not in Paris that night. He was not behind the wheel of the car. He bears no responsible connection to the events in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Every